How are bad economics students like selfish point guards? They won't pass. Welcome back. In this video, we will use a little math to reinforce a central concept from the previous episodes, that trade deficits and surpluses are inherently linked to the price of storage. By the end of this episode, you should be able to describe how the price of storage is related to the concept of interest rates. And you should be able to explain how differences in interest rates across people or countries naturally lead to trade deficits and surpluses. Before we delve deeper into the relationships between storage and interest rates, deficits and surpluses, let's review what we covered in previous episodes. First, recall that a financial asset is like a claim. It entitles its owner to purchase goods or services in the future. Second, a financial asset is characterized by 4 properties. It keeps a record of the claim, it is recognizable by all parties involved, it is hard to copy, and it is durable. Our most well-known example of a financial asset is money. We learned that trade deficits occur when people, or countries, receive, in total, more goods and services than they give out. The difference of the value of goods and services they receive, less the value they give out, is made up for by financial assets they pay their trading partners. Likewise, trade surpluses occur when people or countries give out more goods and services than they receive. They receive financial assets from their trading partners to make up the difference of the value of goods and services they give out, less the value they receive. No trade deficit or surplus occurs when the value of goods and services received is equal to the value of goods and services given out, and no financial assets have been accumulated or depleted on balance. We also showed in earlier episodes that trade deficits and surpluses allow people to trade output over time. That is, people who run a trade surplus can use the financial assets they receive today to purchase output in the future. And people who run trade deficits and give out financial assets today promise to deliver output in the future to the bearer of those assets. In other words, people running trade deficits receive extra output today in exchange for output delivered in the future. Finally, we showed that differences in the willingness to pay for storage, even when storage opportunities do not otherwise exist, are key to generating trading opportunities that involve trade deficits and trade surpluses. We discussed 2 examples of when trade deficits and surpluses seem to make good economic sense because of differences in the willingness to pay for storage. In the first example, we studied an economy populated by 2 types of agents, young and old. The young wish to save for retirement. The old wish to spend down their savings. Thus, the young and the old have different inclinations to pay to store output, which leads to trade. The young run trade surpluses, and the old run trade deficits. In the second example, we studied 2 places with different growing seasons, north and south. When food is plentiful in the north, the opposite is true in the south. Thus, at the same time the north would like to store food in advance of its upcoming winter, the south has no need to store food since their winter is ending. Again, these differences lead naturally to trade deficits and surpluses. In this episode, we wish to consider another example in detail, the case of Suzanne and Melanie. Both Suzanne and Melanie can spend their time today working at activities that produce output today, or working at activities today that will yield output in the future. We assume, as before, that whenever it is produced, output cannot be stored and must be consumed at the time it is produced. For this reason, we will say that Suzanne and Melanie can spend their time today working to produce output for current consumption or output for future consumption. Suppose that for each hour Suzanne works today producing current consumption, she can make 100 tons of what she produces. And for each hour she works today producing future consumption, she can make 105 tons. Melanie, however, produces current consumption at a rate of 40 tons per hour. and for each hour she works today producing future consumption, she can make 44 tons. Assuming, as we have in prior videos, that neither Suzanne nor Melanie can work more than 8 hours a day, any increase in production of current consumption reduces production of future consumption, and vice versa. These trade-offs are represented in their production possibilities frontier. The table highlights that for Suzanne or Melanie to enjoy more current consumption, they must forgo some future consumption, since time spent working is fixed. Let's say that Suzanne and Melanie both spend 4 hours a day making current consumption and future consumption. As the production possibilities frontier shows, if Suzanne wants an extra 100 tons of current consumption, that is, 500 tons in total, she must forgo 105 tons of future consumption, resulting in 315 tons in total. Let's do some math. If Suzanne wants 1 extra ton of current consumption, this requires 0.6 minutes more work. We got this number as follows. If Suzanne makes 100 tons every 60 minutes, this means she makes 1 ton every 0.6 minutes. But if Suzanne spends an extra 0.6 minutes making current consumption, she spends 0.6 minutes less making future consumption. Each unit of future consumption takes 0.571 minutes to produce. In the extra 0.6 minutes Suzanne shifts from future consumption to current consumption, she makes 0.6 divided by 0.571 equals 1.05 fewer tons of future consumption. This means that the price for Suzanne of 1 extra ton of current consumption is 1.05 tons of future consumption. Now consider Melanie. If Melanie wants 1 extra ton of current consumption, this requires 1.5 minutes more work. The math for this is as follows. If she makes 40 tons every 60 minutes, this means she makes 1 ton every 1.5 minutes. But if she spends an extra 1.5 minutes making current consumption, she spends 1.5 minutes less making future consumption. Each unit of future consumption takes her 1.364 minutes to produce. So in the extra 1.5 minutes, Melanie shifts from future consumption to current consumption. She makes 1.5 divided by 1.364 equals 1.1 fewer tons of future consumption. Thus, the price of 1 more ton of current consumption to Melanie is 1.1 tons of future consumption. Suppose 1 ton of consumption costs $1, for example. Then the price of $1 more current consumption in units of future consumption is $1.10. We can see the prices in this table. From this table, we can see that Suzanne is the low-cost producer of current consumption, and Melanie is the low-cost producer of future consumption. So far, we have exactly calculated the price of current consumption in units of future consumption for Suzanne and Melanie. I leave it to you to verify that we have correctly computed the reciprocal price, the price of 1 unit of future consumption in units of current consumption. Throughout these episodes, focusing on deficits and surpluses, I have talked about the concept of the price of storage. We can understand exactly what that means by studying the price of future consumption for Suzanne and Melanie. Suppose Suzanne would like to have available 1 extra unit of future consumption. This means she has to forgo enough labor to make 0.95 units of current consumption. That is the price. This is analogous to saying that Suzanne has to store, or in this case not use, 0.95 units of current consumption to have available an extra 1 unit of future consumption. The analogy is not exact, as Suzanne is not literally making 0.95 units of current consumption and storing it for the future until it becomes 1 unit of future consumption. That cannot be done, as we have assumed consumption is not storable. But the analogy is close. Literally, storing output means making output and forgoing its use, i.e., foregoing its potential current consumption benefits, so it can be stored to the future. In our example, without storable output, any time Suzanne spends making consumption today is time not spent making future consumption. For Suzanne to have future consumption, she must forego some current consumption. So the price of future consumption in units of current consumption is the price of storage. But wait, what is the price of current consumption in units of future consumption? It must be related to the price of storage. But the price of consumption today relative to future consumption has a common name, the interest rate. Or, rather, it is 1 plus the interest rate. So, the interest rate is directly related to the price of storage. The price of consumption today relative to future consumption has a common name, the interest rate. Or, to be precise, this price is 1 plus the interest rate. To understand this concept, consider this simple example. Suppose you have $1 in your pocket. Also suppose that your local bank pays 5% interest per year. If you put the dollar in the bank, next year you will have $1.05, or $1.05, which you can use to purchase consumption next year. That is how interest works. However, suppose that instead of putting the dollar in the bank, you purchase $1 worth of current consumption. Then, that $1 of current consumption cost you $1.05 worth of future consumption. Why? Because if you had saved the $1 at the bank, you could have purchased $1.05 of consumption next year. In other words, when the interest rate is 5%, the price of consuming an extra unit, or dollar, of consumption today is 1.05 units, or dollars, of consumption in the future. The price of consumption today, in units of future consumption, 1.05 in this example, is equal to 1 plus the interest rate, 5%. Returning to the case of Melanie and Suzanne, we can see that if future consumption means next year, then the interest rate for Suzanne is 5%, since the price of her current consumption is 1.05. And the interest rate for Melanie is 10%, since her price is 1.10. As shown by the highlighted cells in the table, Suzanne has the comparative advantage in production of current consumption, and Melanie has the comparative advantage in production of future consumption. Our trader, Kenny, by adopting the strategy of buying low and selling high, can make profits by inducing trade between Suzanne and Melanie. Kenny, for example, can offer to buy 1 unit of current consumption from Suzanne in exchange for 1.06 units of future consumption. Suzanne will accept this trade because she only forgoes 1.05 units of future consumption to make 1 extra unit of current consumption to give to Kenny. So after trade, she is strictly better off by 0.01 units of future consumption. Kenny then offers to sell to Melanie 1 unit of current consumption in exchange for 1.09 units of future consumption. Melanie agrees to the trade because by producing 1 unit less of current consumption, she can make 1.10 units of future consumption. She gives to Kenny 1.09 of these units, and after trade is strictly better off by 0.01 units of future consumption. So, by proposing a trade where he buys each good from the producer with a comparative advantage, Kenny makes profits of 0.03 units of future consumption. Suzanne and Melanie are each better off by 0.01 units of future consumption, and thus all parties are better off after the trade and the trade occurs. Notice the patterns of trade. Kenny buys current consumption from Suzanne and sells that to Melanie, and he buys future consumption from Melanie and sells that to Suzanne. The person with the lowest interest rate, the lowest price of current consumption, exports current consumption. The person with the highest interest rate, the highest price of current consumption, and the lowest price of future consumption exports future consumption. Thus, differences in interest rates lead to trade deficits and surpluses, which are just trades of current consumption for future consumption. The person with the lowest interest rate, Suzanne, runs the trade surplus, and the person with the highest interest rate, Melanie, runs the trade deficit. The example we have just described follows almost exactly the same logic as the example we worked through in earlier episodes with Dean and Randy. But instead of trades of beer for cheese, in this example, the goods traded are current consumption and future consumption. Perhaps the only difference, and it is key, is that future consumption does not actually exist today. To facilitate a trade of current consumption for future consumption, Kenny uses financial assets. He offers an IOU to Suzanne for 1.06 units of future consumption. Suzanne runs a trade surplus since she gives current consumption to Kenny and receives a financial asset, the IOU, in return. Kenny receives an IOU from Melanie for 1.09 units of future consumption and gives to Melanie 1 unit of current consumption. Melanie runs a trade deficit since she imports current consumption and gives out financial assets in return. Kenny keeps 0.03 units of future consumption as his profit. When the future production occurs, those IOUs will be redeemed. But at the time of the trade, the IOUs are necessary to establish record keeping, since a key part of the trade involves output that has not yet been produced. So, what did we learn today?
We learned that the price of storage can be thought of as the price of 1 unit of future consumption in units of current consumption. We showed that the reciprocal of this price, the price of 1 unit of current consumption in units of future consumption, is equal to 1 plus the interest rate. Using the same tools as in our examples with Dean and Randy, we showed how patterns of trade naturally emerge between Melanie and Suzanne. But instead of the goods being called beer and cheese, the goods are called current consumption and future consumption. The only distinction is that Dean and Randy trade beer and cheese at the same time, but Melanie and Suzanne trade current and future consumption over time. And this trade over time requires record keeping, which is accomplished using financial assets. We showed that since Melanie and Suzanne have different interest rates, trade deficits and surpluses will naturally occur. The person with the lowest interest rate, Suzanne, runs a trade surplus. She exports current consumption to Melanie and imports future consumption from her. And the person with the highest interest rate, Melanie, runs the trade deficit, importing current consumption from Suzanne and exporting future consumption to her.